夠鐘未啊？仲爭幾秒？哦，等多幾秒先。
A few seconds short, so let's wait for another few minutes.
Members,
we have just formed a quorum. And this is the subcommittee on the long-term housing strategy. The meeting is now called to order. Item 1 on the agenda, election of the chairman and the deputy chairman. This is a routine, and we have to go through the routine. So do we need to elect the chairman and the deputy chairman again this year? Chairman, I think, why don't you just continue in your chairmanship? Do other members agree? Mr. Abraham Sheck? Yes, I agree. Okay, so both myself and Mr. Tony Chair will continue to serve you. Thank you. Item 2, receiving public views on the long-term housing strategy consultation document. We'd like to welcome the administration team and the deputation. So let's invite the administration team, including the Bureau Director and his team, together with the deputations, to join us. Welcome, Professor Anthony Chiang, Secretary for Transport and Housing, and Permanent Secretary Mr. Prescott, and Ms. Agnes Wong, Deputy Secretary for the Bureau. Let's wait for the deputations to come in. We do have a large number of deputations meeting us today, so it might take some time for them to come in. Welcome to the deputations. Welcome to the subcommittee on the long-term housing strategy. We are here to receive your views on the consultation document. With us today are Professor Anthony Chiang, Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. D.W. Prescott, Permanent Secretary for the Bureau, and Ms. Agnes Wong, Deputy Secretary. I'll first invite the Bureau Director to say a few words, and then the meeting will be divided into two parts because of the number of deputations. The first part will be from 2:35 to 4:40, and then there will be a short break between 4:40 and 4:50, and then the second part will start from 4:50 and then at around 6:55. Before the beginning of every session, I'd like to remind members that every deputation or individual will be given 3 minutes, and I'll stop you after the time's up. And your comments and submissions will not be covered by the Legislative Powers and Privileges Ordinance. And if you have prepared a written script, please mark your name on your script. And before you leave the conference room, please do give a copy of that to our staff so that we can make copies for members' reference. I'll be inviting the Bureau Director to say a few words in his opening statement. Thank you, Chairman. The public consultation on the LTHS started in early September. A number of activities have been held, including 4 public forums. And both tomorrow and next week, 2 more forums will be held in order to collect the views from the community on LTHS. We have also attended the meetings of the district councils and also listened to district councillors' views. And thanks to this subcommittee's arrangement, we are able to meet with different deputations and individuals, so we'll be able to listen to their views on the consultation document. The consultation document proposed that for every family in Hong Kong will provide appropriate and also affordable housing. And the consultation document sets out many issues involved related to housing, and it also proposes a number of recommendations for members to think about. And these are not preconceived ideas adopted by the administration. And upon the end of the consultation period, we will collate the comments, and then we will be submitting a report in the first quarter of next year. And after considering the report and public's comments, the administration will then come up with a long-term housing strategy. There are several directions set out in the paper. First of all, it sets out that the crux of the problem is the serious imbalance between supply and demand. That's why the LTHS steering committee proposes that the administration should act as a supplier to provide steady housing, in particular public housing, and we should also make the best use of existing housing resources. The steering committee is of the view that in order to meet the medium to low income families' needs, we have to provide more public housing, and initially 60-40 should be the ratio between public and private housing. And by public housing, we are referring to PRH and also HOS flats. Other than that, the steering committee also proposes that we will have to provide more PRH flats in order to meet the medium to lower income families and also the younger families. And also, according to the projection, we believe that for private housing, inevitably there would be some vacant flats, and by that projection, we have now come up with the total target for the next 10 years. It should be 470,000 units. When compared to the existing plan by the administration and also the committed supply, there will be an excess of about 70,000 units. In order to meet the new target, the steering committee is of the view that there is a need for the administration to identify more land for building more flats, and will adopt a multi-pronged approach in order to identify more sites for building more flats. I have to reiterate here, the administration is not trying to identify land indiscriminately. We are actually trying to take members of the community's needs as our first priority. We also have to make sure that all the sites identified would also meet various needs, including environment, transport, and also community facilities requirements. In the long run, we have to increase the per-person living space standard. We also have to have adequate recreational and amenities facilities, and therefore all these would require more land to be identified. With regard to the problem of subdivided flats, I'd like to state that the government's policy is to phase out all the subdivided flats in industrial buildings. With regard to subdivided flats in comprehensive or composite sites and also residential developments, we will take appropriate action so that where we will have to deal with fire safety issues and building safety issues before we can regulate them. With regard to the proposed registration system or other systems in order to better regulate subdivided flats in comprehensive building and also mixed residential, commercial building and residential buildings, we understand that for subdivided unit tenants, there are also some concerns and it's also a bit more controversial. That's why at today's meeting, I would like to listen to more comments first. Of course, the root of the problem and a more effective way to solve this problem is to provide steady supply so that we can expedite the time for housing those on the waiting list. So much for my remarks. I'll be all ears to the comments. All right, after all the deputations have spoken, I'll invite you to respond again. And then the floor will be open to members' questions. So that's for the first session. Okay, deputations, please speak in accordance with the seating order. So I'll invite you to speak for 3 minutes. If you have brought with you anything that you'd like to display here, please make sure that they would not be blocking our sight line so that we won't be able to see your faces. So first, Mr. Francis Ho from the Hong Kong Institute of Housing. Over to you, Mr. Ho. Thank you. On behalf of the Housing Institute of Housing, I'd like to welcome the release of this document, but then as professionals, we'd like to provide some input and also state our concerns. First of all, with regard to community needs and also infrastructure facilities in the newly developed areas, we believe that there should be comprehensive regulation, including transport network and also recreational facilities in order to make sure that these newly developed areas would be self-sufficient. In terms of the number of flats to be provided, quality is equally important. We have to consider the needs of the tenants and also the environment would also play a very important role. Well, we believe that the proposed housing ratio is acceptable, but then we also have to consider the changes in demography. We also have to ensure that the changes are in line with the actual demand. And in the long run, we also have to look at the management, but then the consultation document is silent on how management could be improved. And that will also increase the demand for professional property management managers. And in the next 10 years, we expect that at least 300 will be needed, and 1,000 superintendent grade will be required. And even though we have 300 graduates every year, but then that would only meet the current demand with natural wastage. All in all, we hope that we'll be able to introduce a licensing system for property management in order to help the profession to move towards the professionalism, and then that would also help attract more new blood to join the profession. And institutions should also be given more support so that they can offer more courses, and there can also be full-time and part-time courses offered so that the profession will be able to have enough talents to fill the vacancies. We would also like to encourage private owners so that for vacant industrial and residential units, they can also be changed or converted into subdivided flats in line with the requirements and regulations. With regard to the increase of land, reclamation is also a possibility, but then we must make sure that navigational channels will not be affected. And of course, in the long run, we hope to convert more public housing flats and also increase the supply. And we can also increase the density so that more units can be built. With regard to the regulation of subdivided flats, we do have some reservation about this proposal because we are concerned that the relevant department might not have the necessary manpower to deal with that, and also enforcement would also be difficult, and also even for inspection, that would also require a lot of manpower. Thank you. Next, Mr. Long Chi-Wai, Community Development Initiative. Thank you, Chairman. Concerning the long-term housing strategy on the supply of public housing, I think there is a consensus in the community. That is, there is a shortfall because if you divide the number, we are talking about some 28,000 every year taking into account both public rental housing and HOS, and you're already trying your best to increase supply. But I'd like to say a few more words about things other than supply, because in the consultation document, the administration also referred to different ways and means to increase supply. You also talk about developing new towns. I think very few people will say no to this, but then how are we going to do that? Basically, the approach right now is a bottom-up approach, and there is very little thinking given to the community networking. So basically, you are demolishing or clearing a particular site, and then you would move people in. I think in developing new areas or new towns, we must make sure that they are going to become a place where they can live and work happily therein, and therefore it should have been a bottom-up approach. And there are certain approaches. For example, in developing Luen Wo Hui, we also adopted a relatively bottom-up approach. And in adopting such an approach, that would also avoid a repeat of the Tin Shui Wai model, so that we would have a mismatch between the jobs and where the people are. And as a result, the administration has to subsidize people for their traveling expenses. We don't think this is a good approach. And also on the housing strategy, I think the subject is very much a supply-oriented document. All right, we have no qualms about that either. But then the problem of housing is not just about short supply or inadequate supply. So other than increasing supply, the administration should also look at how it can manage demand. And also in terms of investment and housing demand, are we able to distinguish between the two, so that housing should not become a tool for speculation? So if we are able to apply the right medicine to the problem, then we might need to consider other alternatives. For example, rent control, so that we can do a better work in terms of demand control. Time's up. Next, Public Housing Living Federation of Public Housing Estates, Mr. Men. We believe that during the election campaign, Mr. C.Y. Leung said that housing would be his top priority, and in the consultation document, we do not see how he is able to realize this goal, and we find that disappointing. And also with regard to the waiting time of 3 years for first allocation, and also the fact that we have now got over 230,000 families on the waiting list, this is really something that is bothering us. And for private housing, we only have private housing, HOS, and also public rental housing. These are the three main categories of supply. But then in the past, there are different ways to solve similar problems. And in terms of land supply, during the short to medium term, in terms of land supply, that might be okay. But then in the longer term, apparently, the administration is not certain about how it can increase land supply, and therefore in the document we do not find any solution. That's why we are very worried. That's why we propose that we should look at the demand side and we should increase supply. And then for public rental or public housing supply, first of all, we have to make sure that we can meet the pledge of 3-year waiting time for those on the waiting list. We should not fine-tune such target because of economic changes. And for public housing supply being the mainstay of housing supply, we agree with that. And we should support that.
It is demand-led. We think that in the coming 10 years, the supply of public, it should be 610,000. And we agree with the 60-40 ratio. When it comes to supply of public housing, we think that every year there should be 28,000 PRX units and 8,000 HOS units. In relation to private housing, there should be land supply to produce no less than 25,000 units. And in relation to needs of different groups, elderly people from the grassroots stratum, and these people should be accorded priority. While according priority to them, they should not get in the way of other groups, say for example singletons. Your time is up. If you haven't finished, please give us your supplementary submission. Next. Public Housing Living Quality Union, Mr. Kwong Kin Shing is not here yet. Mr. Tam, good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to tell you the LTHS of place is Singapore. The population is half of that of Hong Kong, and the area is about half of Hong Kong as well. And if you earn about 7,000 Singaporean dollars for your household, that is about 6,000 Hong Kong dollars. How can they afford to purchase a unit of 2 bedrooms? Singaporeans will only need to spend 4 years of their salary to buy their own flat. And these are indicators. Can Hong Kong do the same in our LTHS, the long-term housing strategy? And how does Singapore get the land? Recently, there is a decision in Singapore that the Air Force airport will be relocated, releasing the land releasing land to build houses. Of course, you won't doubt that national security is of no importance, but they will release 8,000 hectares of land, and they will also relocate their port facilities to release about 1,000 hectares of land. Can that be done in Hong Kong? The PLA owned 2,700 hectares, and they have about 30,000 square feet in total, which is quite a lot, and that is per capita. And in Hong Kong, if you have several tens of square feet, you'll be very happy. There is another one in the Western District. It's a barrack. It's a multi-story building belonging to the PLA, to the garrison. And in the past decade or so, well, most of the units are vacant. Before the reunification, it was occupied by, it was used as quarters for the military. Article 13 of our garrison law says that the PLA should, without any compensation, give the land back to Hong Kong SAR. So, Professor Cheung, we have land. Don't take land from New Territories Northeast. Don't reclaim land. There is a large amount of land for military use that you can use. Next is Green Sense. Miss Yu. Good afternoon, everyone. We're Green Sense. We doubt the housing target of 470,000. We object to blindly setting such a high housing target. The administration's been blindly grabbing land just to meet the target. We see that a lot of sacrifice has been made. Community facilities and open space are sacrificed. The administration may say that when they formulate the housing target, they will take into account planning guidelines. I'd like to say that the Green Sense deals with a lot of cases. In the urban area, we found that in a lot of these cases, the Hong Kong PSG is breached. In Changsha 1, the administration planned to convert an industrial building into open space for a simple reason, that there is insufficient open space in the area. But they pick in an industrial building with 99% utilization rate. And this is ridiculous. Of course, we agree that housing is very important. But you should take into account the needs of people who are living there or people who will live there. They would like to have a decent home, and they need also a decent living environment. People living in SDUs, people living in the urban area, a lot of them live in poor living condition because the housing density is very high. There is poor ventilation. What we don't want to see is an increasing plot ratio as stated in the consultation document, because this will not address housing problems. In the consultation document, they mention public housing being the lead. We don't agree with that. When you try to meet target, you have to at the same time consider demand management. You can look at it in different perspectives instead of just focusing on increasing housing supply. What about population? Do we need to take into account capacity of Hong Kong? Your time's up. Next is 工聯會社會事務委員會 from the FTU, Mr. Look. Thank you. Good afternoon. The FTU welcomes the consultation document. They have taken into account a lot of proposals we put forward in the 1980s. That is, public housing as the lead to be PRH as the lead plus to be supplemented by HOS. And we would like to supplement certain points. First, supply-led is not completely accurate. A better way is demand-led, which means that there should be an accurate estimation of demand of different strata, and to provide suitable housing to them. And we support using PRH unit as the main factor. The public to private housing should be 70-30. It takes time to find land, and the housing target of 470,000, if the ratio is adjusted to 70-30, then for public housing will amount to 330,000 with 5,000 HOS units. We also support the administration in their active effort to increase land supply. In Hung Shui Kiu and Tung Chung, we know that there will be a supply of 170,000. There should be planning and studies to increase land supply, especially reclamation outside the Victoria Harbour should be explored so that there will be continuous supply of land in Hong Kong. We think the LTHS steering committee should become permanent, because over the period of 10 years, there will be a lot of factors to be taken into account, and the waiting time should be shortened to 2 years, and there should be different types of PRH units to meet different needs. And there should be more flexibility and more choices in the allocation, so that people will have found their ideal flat in the first allocation. In the private market, we hope the administration will continue with the cooling measures, and if necessary, introduce property vacancy tax and also capital gains tax. The administration should take reference from affordability of purchases, and in the end, they should review the position of rent control. Next is Advisory Board for Ethnicity and Minority Services, Mr. Rashad. Thank you. We are talking about something that will take place in the coming 10 years. But what about ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, and what difficulties are faced by them and the general public? Do you know that very often it's not just for ethnic minorities? The rental is too high for the general public. Say, for example, 10,000 is the income, but they have to pay 5,000 or 6,000 towards rental. 10 years ago, we talk about what is going to happen in the next 10 years, say in the CH Tong era. But there's just all talk. When the property market collapsed, then they said that, well, it doesn't exist anymore. When they stopped talking about it. Yes, you can talk about what is going to happen in the coming 10 years, but you need to take into account our difficulties. First, affordability, especially ethnic minorities. 2, do we have sufficient facilities? If you live in a certain area, can they afford the rent? And for ethnic minorities, say for example, there are different religions, and there may not be enough facilities for residents. And very often the administration talks about 3 years waiting time. I live in public housing, but I don't think that anyone will be able to get a flat in just 3 years. Before 1997, they talk about building housing units. Well, I don't think that can happen so easily. And we hope that there will be rent control. Say, for example, in old districts, and people who've been in Hong Kong for many years with rent control, residents, whether they are Hong Kong people or ethnic minorities, will find rental affordable. On top of that, planning. They should think about the details. Say, for example, community facilities for different ethnic minorities. You may have read something from the press. In Onyam Estates, children are sitting outside learning the Quran on their religious beliefs. I'm not promoting a certain religion, but it's the case that there are insufficient facilities. When the group is learning Quran, and there may be people playing chess just right next to them. Your time is up. Next is 公屋被迫遷戶關注組 Mr. Lai. Now, the concerned group would like to talk about the criteria when the household is too small for the household size is too small for the PRH unit, and they are forced to move into a smaller unit. And it's not on their own volition that they move. If they don't accept the proposed move, they may be evicted. The administration said that starting from 1992, they would put in place a policy involving PRX units that is too big for the household. And back then, with the redevelopment of Ngau Tau Kok, some PRH tenants are given bigger flats The design of the Wang Tai Hsien public estate is in general bigger than other PRH units. The administration knew full well that such allocation will result in households living in bigger flats. When these tenants, say for example, just two a parent and a child living together, when the parent passed away, then they will be labeled as living in a too big PRH unit. The number of cases has dropped from 34 to 30. Starting from June, they say that they revised the criteria, saying that the elderly person will have to reach 70 before they are not forced to move out. And if you talk about excessive size, well, if you think about housing supply, even if they are moved, that will not result in an increase of number of units. Is it the case that right after they have moved, the new tenant will be able to move in the next day? And we're talking about precious housing resources. We've had meetings with the housing department. They say that they will have to make available 1,000 smaller units just to implement the move. You then have to think of different ways to force tenants to move out. So if that is the case, how can singletons be allocated a flat? So the allocation itself is problematic. They cannot produce enough PRH units. That's why they just want to move people around, trying to juggle the figure. I hope that the administration will stop forcing people out. There is consultation of the LTHS. And why do you still force people to move out? What if, as a result, the criteria will change? Next is from Civic Party, Ms. Leung. The LTHS Steering Committee proposed 470,000 units as the target. We think that the assumption underlying this do not reflect the real situation. As a result, there is a discrepancy. Assuming that people living in a decent living environment will not increase. The steering committee assumed that these people, there won't be an increase. Well, we see that starting from 1990, because of the rising property prices, a lot of people are reluctant to have children. And for people who are living in inadequate housing, the steering committee took into account information of SDU study, but people who are living in remote area and also in squatter areas are not taken into account. We think the Civic Party thinks that the number has been underestimated. A comprehensive LTHS should define what is adequate housing. We have to take into account job opportunities, community facilities, to decide what is adequate housing. If SDUs are regulated by, say, a registration system, housing supply will drop drastically. Rental will increase, which will add to the burden of grassroots. 1998, there was an ordinance enacted related to bed space, and people who are living in registered cage homes, the living condition is still appalling. The problems still remain, and SDUs cannot in any way be adequate housing. According to information of the THB, a person should get no less than 7 square meters. We hope that such criteria will adopt this spatial requirement as one of the factors of adequate housing. We have 5 suggestions to find land in urban area. First, develop brownfield site. 2, increase plot ratio and redevelop PRH estate. 3, encourage public bodies, say for example HS, to help in developing housing projects. 5, study taking back military sites and also to review PRH policies, to review the small house policy.
Next, the Low-Income Families Mutual Aid Network, Ms. Chu On Ling. I come from Sham Shui Po at Yikok Street. They increased the rent by $800 and another unit, 2,900 to 3,900. Abney Street, 3,300 last year. This year, 4,300, another $1,000. Now, another case, 3,300, also to 40, by 1,200 increased. Typo Road, an increase of $1,800, $5,300. Keelung Street, 3,800 to 7,000. Now, the landlords say if you can't pay the rent, you should move. Then they have plenty of new tenants. Now, the consultation document says that there should be adequate housing for every Hong Kong family. Right now, the rentals are not affordable by the grassroots families. I applied for PRH in 2007. It's now 6 years. I still have received no news. I'm not the only example. There are other Kai Fongs in the same situation. The 3-year waiting list is not true. 5 members are there in my family, and we live in SDU. The landlord wants to increase by $1,500. My family income is $15,000. The rent takes up 36%. We have no space for my children to do their homework. How can they grow healthily? We are snails without shells. We suffer from the landlords. We pay exorbitant rents. We demand resumption of rent control, more land for PRH, shorter waiting list, to realize the 3-year waiting list in reality. I hope the Secretary can keep his promise to provide adequate housing for all Hong Kong families. We do not accept the LTHS. Please redo it. You cannot come out. You cannot come out. Colleagues, please receive the items on behalf. You are breaching the procedures of LegCo. You cannot submit things here. Otherwise, I have to ask you to leave. You cannot make submissions of items. You can express your views in your time slots, but you cannot engage in other action in this chamber. Next, Industrial Relations Institute, Ms. Chow Wing-Chi. Thank you. I note your sincerity. The document has a wrong name. It should be reaching consensus of the rich. You are saying that you will not touch the interests of the established interests. Now, and at the same time, you tell us the problems of rent control, etc. You know what's happening in the old district in Sham Shui Po? It's difficult to find a rental unit of 100 square feet of less than $4,000. The old districts have turned into construction sites, or they have become SDUs. The tenants are being kicked out. The URA is providing units that facilitate the landlords. The URA takes no responsibility in resettling the tenants. The remaining landlords increase the rents exorbitantly. We are like people subjected to extortion by the triads. Now, the landlord tells a tenant, if you can't pay the rent, then you can be a prostitute. We are all like chicken in farms. We are living in SDUs, in caged homes. The Secretary, if you continue to ignore the plight of residents in old districts, if you continue to favor the rich, then you are planting a time bomb that's very big. Now, the immediate priority is to institute rent control and increase PLH. You can look at the case of Germany. Their government plays an active role to safeguard the housing of the population. They have rent control, rent subsidy, and other measures. And in Sweden, the government has a housing authority which establishes the rental level. Private rentals cannot be a certain percentage of public housing rental. Now, the government is concerned that rent control would cause the landlords to withdraw their units. That's not common sense. They will not leave their units vacant. The government should seriously consider vacancy tax if they indeed leave their units vacant. The government has to safeguard the rights to live. Rent control can stabilize society, reduce polarization, and stabilize the property market, ease the waiting list, the pressure on waiting list, and reduce people's expenditure on housing. Now, I have to stop you. We have to stick to the 3-minute time slot. You can submit a written submission. I cannot offer exceptions to certain speakers, otherwise the others will question how fair I am. So I must terminate your speech when time is up. Next, Women Workers Corporation, Ms. Pong Lai Heng. We are middle-aged women workers who have to seek lower paid jobs. We are offering our views. We are in manufacturing and service industries. Work is unstable, pay is low. In the past, we could still live with parents in PLH. However, the government has introduced a housing policy saying that your family is well-to-do, pays double rent, and the children are no longer able to inherit the units, so the children have to apply for PLH themselves. There's a long waiting time, then they have to rent rooms. 100 square feet used to be $3,000 odd, is $4,000 odd. It's much faster than the increase in wages. In 2004, the government abolished rent control across the board for us middle-aged women workers and grassroots women. That's very detrimental. In the past few years, rentals have kept going up at the whim of landlords. We have to pay 40 to 50% of our income towards the rent. We believe that housing is the basic need of workers. The housing is now subjected to speculation by landlords and business people. The government has a duty to safeguard the right to live, to housing. for workers. We have the following demands. Firstly, rent control as quickly as possible to stop the crazy climb in rentals, to safeguard the right to housing of workers. Secondly, increase PRH construction for singletons and grassroots families. 3, raise the upper income limit for singleton applicants. You can refer to median income. Next, SDU concern group for Kwai Chung. I am Ho Lai Chun. Now, I like to ask, how much is the LTHS helping us? Now, many kaifongs are paying high rent. The rent can be increased by over $1,000, at least $500. Some working poor pay more than half of their salaries towards the rentals. Some CSSA families, single-parent families, and say a 2-member CSSA household, they receive only $2,500 housing assistance. The rent has increased to $3,200, and the CSSA they get is $5,500. So they have to pay out of pocket. If there's no rent control, then rents keep shooting up. How can these kaifongs afford these exorbitant rentals? And many kaifongs are not yet qualified to apply for PRH, and they are paying these high rents. They can't afford to pay it both for housing and food with the meager CSSA entitlements. The rents keep going up, and there should be transitional housing to help these people who are still on the waiting list. Sorry, my throat aches a little. So you should help these people who are on the waiting list, so that they pay less in rent. They can have a little more money left to survive against inflation, so that the children can have little more secure families, because they are constantly under threat of eviction by landlords. The landlords may not allow them to stay, and they have to sleep on the street. So I hope the LTHS really considers the reality for these grassroots people. Next, Ms. Lee Hiu Kwan of Concern for SDU Units of Kwai Chung. I am a singleton. I'm a single parent. I have several children. I'm the only breadwinner. The SDUs are unauthorized building structures, and we pay for almost $5,000, and we have to pay $1,500 in electricity charge, and $500 per quarter for water, and $4,000 in rent. So even if you earn $10,000 a month, the bulk of it goes to housing, and what's left for food and for education. The government promises a 3-year waiting list. I've applied for 4 years. There's been no news. I don't understand. Is the government has any intention to keep its word? 3 years later, the rents have gone up even more. Will they reimburse us the difference? The landlords increase the rent every 2 years. Like the lady just said, if you can't afford the rent, then you have to move onto the street. You can't even sleep under flyovers. Now, you people in the upper echelons, you have no worries at all. Unlike us wage earners, every month, as soon as we receive our pay, everything is paid out. We worry how we're going to pay for our next meal. We work hard, and it's not enough to pay the rent. We hope the government would quickly allocate PRH to SDU residents and not allow the landlords to act in such outrageous ways. You should prohibit them from charging exorbitant rents and utilities. Every year the government has this or that allowance, but none for us. Other people get all sorts of allowances. We only face rent increases. Thank you. Next, Mr. Ng Kwan Lim of Kwai Chung Housing Affairs Concern Group. Now, in the LTHS document, this is mostly about long-term policy. Of course, that's okay, but have you considered those people on the waiting list? Now, during the waiting period, will the government offer some substantial help? Now, recently in Kwai Chung, we witnessed a figure, a Kai Fong, recently was evicted out of SDU on a rooftop, and then he found a unit, 90 square feet, $7,000, just been refurbished. It's unbelievable. We can see that rents have increased to an unacceptable level, and we see that in the rent agreements, mostly is 1 year fixed rent and 1 year flexible. And in cases of renewals, the landlords will not sign the new lease. So every 2 or 3 months, they increase the rent every 2 or 3 months. So they have no security in rent at all. And in the middle of this year, in Kwai Kim Mansion, 100 odd square feet SDU. Within a short period, the tenants are demanded to leave. It's very inequitable. Now, in their right to stay, the tenants are completely unprotected. So can the government do something so that these Kai Fongs, while waiting for PRH, now they understand that waiting takes time, but in the interim, can the government do something to allay their worries? Also, many Kai Fongs are now facing eviction or demolition issues or problems. For those Kai Fongs who have been waiting for over 3 years or who are facing the abolition of SDUs, can the government offer some assistance? We're not talking just about transit centers on vacant land. Can there be vacant dormitories or hostels for them? Now, these are not ordinary tubes. These are rent control I was going to give this to the secretary. I don't think he will receive it right now. Your time is up. Now the Federation of Kowloon, Hong Kong and Kowloon Labour Unions, Mr. Kong Yat Fong. Now, in recent years, there has been an imbalance. Many middle-income families face higher rents, and the grassroots families can't even afford SDUs. Some take the risk of living in SDUs in industrial buildings, live in bad environments against the law. And there is no relief measures in the LTHS. It thinks rent control is not preferable. Now we have the following proposals. Firstly, for those on the waiting list, there should be rental subsidies. Now, in recent years, the government offered concessions for PRH tenants, but many of those waiting for PRH beyond 3 years face high rental increases. The rental concessions should be extended to them based on the rent that they would pay if they are in PRH. So this would reduce the pressure for building PRH. The government can plan land use more flexibly as a result. And we think that rent control should be reintroduced. Now, rental increases are often 50 to 60% or even 100%. For grassroots families face limited options. They have difficulty finding accommodation. They may have to move within 1 month upon notice by the landlord. So there should be rent control. Also, there should be policies to help the grassroots. Most people would like to be adequately housed. The executive introduced measures that have not been satisfactory.
So to solve this problem, we have to look at how we can increase supply from different avenues. For example, we can increase GIC sites, and also we should also provide sites where the developers will have to build flats of a particular size, and for flats with designated size, that would also be able to help control the price. And for the more convenient sites, we can also flexibly look at the public facilities in building more units so that traveling expenses could also be reduced, and that would also provide convenience to the residents. In the long run, we have to look at the situation with regard in relation to the demographic changes, and that's why we in the consultation document it just talks about some medium to long-term policy, but then it's just a drop in the bucket. Next, Mr. Andrew Lee, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Chairman, we believe that the comprehensiveness of the document is very important, and also continuity is very important. And given the fact that it's a long-term strategy, we have to look at the next 20-30 years situation, and the distribution of the population and the demographic profile would also be very important. We have to get hold of those figures before we can provide an accurate picture as to how many units will be needed for the different layers of our community. In terms of land supply, well, to form a site is very important. We support that we should go for reclamation after all the other alternatives have been exhausted, and we should try our best not to affect the ecology as far as possible. And also by payment of a premium, and we should allow people to change the density, and we should also allow people to apply for rezoning, and if we can expedite the zoning process, that could also help. And we also agree with the Hong Shui Kiu and also NT Northeast new development area, because we believe that these areas have a lot of unused sites and they are less crowded. And by developing those areas, that could also help improve the environment, and we would also be able to provide adequate housing. With regard to the facilities that have been underutilized, we should speed up redevelopment. For example, in Shao Kei Wan, the Minghua block can also be redeveloped, and in doing so, we'll be able to increase the number of units substantially. We also do not support the policy on subdivided flats because, after all, the living environment of subdivided flats is very poor. And I think the core issue here is to increase PRH and HOS supply. At the same time, for new towns, other than increasing the number of flats, we believe that we should also provide more community facilities, including employment, retail, medical services, and so on. All these will have to be provided in tandem. With regard to elderly housing, with an aging population, we can see that in the next 10-20 years, the speed will be a lot faster, and therefore we should also plan for elderly housing. And we propose that we could integrate with our neighboring cities. We can also rent or lease their land so that we can build the facilities that we need. For example, the Macau government has also been using Wangtam to build the Macau University, and then certain sites can then be vacated for constructing public housing units. Next, SOCO, Mr. Chick. Thank you, Chairman. In his opening statement, the chairman also said that the secretary said that subdivided flats regulation would be a controversial subject. We'd like to comment on this. During the past year or so, we have conducted surveys on industrial buildings and also singletons, and also the overall situation with regard to subdivided flats. Well, it all boils down to the following. Number one, rents are high, and it would account for a very substantial part of their income. And for a long time, we've been saying that the administration should build more public housing. And at the LTHS meeting, the secretary said that the long-term solution is to build more public housing flats. We do admire this change, but then at the same time, we are concerned that it's almost like a shield. All right, it would take a long time to come up with public housing because it takes at least 5 years for the production of flats. So what is to be done in the meantime? So as far as the tenants are concerned, when will they be allocated a flat? But then if you right now, their housing environment will be affected. What they are most concerned about is, as some have said, all right, that's about housing ordinance, and the other one is the buildings ordinance, as we have heard a lot about. Because if you look at the express provisions, if you follow all the instructions, then according to my observation, many of these subdivided flats will not be able to pass the test. So they would not be able to pass the test of such inspection. And if you try to regulate that, is it really possible? Because just a week or two ago, the Buildings Department also had this industrial action or industrial strike because there is already a backlog of over 50,000 units that have to be inspected. So if we are to regulate subdivided flats, will the administration be able to handle the workload? And if we are not able to do that, then it would exist just in name. It's like a shell without any substance. And also, whoever can afford not to live in subdivided flats would not do so. So they are actually balancing their income and safety, or else they would always go for a better place. And also, if you are going to introduce this licensing system, we are concerned about the rents. They would go up very substantially. And also, there would also be this wave of eviction. So many people will have to move out. So where will they go? And many are actually living in bed space apartments, and it's not fit for families. And also, all right, for the 2015 exercise, all right, the interim housing will be cleared, and that would also further limit the supply. Well, our impression is that there is a high chance that the administration is going to introduce this licensing system anyway. If you are going to do that, you will have to make sure that support measures are available. For example, will there be interim housing at a community level? Next, Mr. Chen Xiuming, Shadow of LTHS Steering Committee. Thank you. Well, during the past few years, many members of the public and also officials find the situation really heartrending. Well, we have seen the fire at Hafayun Street, and also in Changsha Wan, there was also another fire. resulting in many deaths. And these are really breaking many people's hearts. And also we can see that there are some coffin-like cubicles, and people would actually have to crawl into their so-called apartment. So this has been a no problem. It has been with us for many decades, and we've been looking forward to this document as to how many units will be built in order to deal with this grassroots housing problem. But then they just give us this 470,000 units, and looking at the 6:4 ratio, we're just talking about some 282,000 public housing. And as a result, grassroots would be put in a desperate position. All right, 230,000 families are on the waiting list, and you're only going to build 200,000 plus in 10 years, so 230,000 units. So how are you going to solve the problem? Both families and singletons will be waiting for this, and the queue will get longer and longer. So there are several problems here. Well, for the 294,000 newly set up families, well, you have underestimated the figure, because many of the households have found it difficult to split families or split households. And also in the next 10 years, how many units will have to be redeveloped? As for private redevelopment, you're actually assuming that, well, for those buildings over the age of 50 years, they can be redeveloped. In fact, that would also add up to over 100,000. I'm giving you these examples, and I think that 470,000 units would have many holes. And also, you will not be able to shorten the queue at all. I've also visited a family of 4, and they are not able to wait any further. All right, since May 2007, the mother applied for public housing, and in 2010 she contracted blood cancer, and now she's still waiting. And then by the time when she asked if her case could be expedited, the housing department staff told her that well, do you know how many people are waiting? There are many people who are suffering from cancer too. And now she has passed away, and still her family has yet to be allocated a flat. So she has waited for over 6 years. And I can also bet with you this. That is one of the objectives of the long-term housing strategy, is to provide adequate and affordable housing to people. All right, in 10 years' time, will you be able to guarantee that everybody in Hong Kong will be able to have affordable and adequate housing? And if you're not able to do it, then will you be prepared to go and live in a subdivided flat with all the members of the steering committee? Next, Alliance for Defending Grassroots Housing Rights, Ms. Yim Pik Fan. Thank you, Chairman. Bureau Director, when you still taught public policy at the CTU back in those days, and more recently you were already the Vice Chancellor of IED, and we met you, and we talked about those on the waiting list and also the problems that we are facing. Well, Bureau Director, you should at least have been able to do it. That is, you should be able to come up with a long-term housing strategy. But then when we look at the consultation document, as some of the speakers just said, we are not happy with this at all. Because on many occasions, when we said that with regard to the land policy in Hong Kong, we would like to consolidate all the views and comments, and on different occasions, we managed to gather together a number of groups, and we tried to discuss it amongst ourselves to see what initiatives can be rolled out in order to meet the needs of those requiring better housing. And apparently this is no different from earlier policy papers, and the overall strategy of the administration is just to stabilize the property market so that we can all become housing slaves in order to meet the needs of the developers. We find it most disappointing. So looking at what you said here, you made several points. In fact, earlier on, when we told you about our expectations on the LTHS, we already told you this. You also talk about the well-off tenants, and in fact you said that you needed to tighten up the policy so that more people could be encouraged to move out and buy their own flats, so that the flats can then be vacated for other people to use. But then you've also said that for well-off tenants, they only account for some 3% of the total number of tenants in public rental housing, and it's a very small percentage. Why do you have to do so much in order to encourage them to move out. And what is happening right now is there are many singleton elders living in PRH, and their children have already moved out, and they are living in private housing. They are forced to buy private housing, and they might have been forced to become tenants of subdivided flats. And in order to achieve the so-called aging in place, then the entire community will have to pay for that. And we will have to make sure that we can take care of these elders instead of requiring their children to take care of them by living with them. So I think it's a waste of efforts and a waste of time. And you also said that when people buy flats, the LTHS is asking the younger people to buy their own flats. But then you've been promoting or advocating this. That is for white form applicants. They can also buy second-hand HOS flats. Well, in some cases, they do not have their own income, but then their parents might have some extra money to help them out by making the down payment, and then they would be buying a flat which they don't really need. So they are not going to stay there. They're just buying that for preservation of value, for as a form of investment. So really, please review this. Next, platform for concerning subdivided flats and issue in Hong Kong, Mr. Wong Keng Lai. Thank you. With regard to this document, we are disappointed because the document says that we will have to give priority to those who are living in inadequate housing. Well, for those who are given priority, in fact, in the short term, very little will be done. And also for the 6:4 ratio, well, according to some academics, they have already released articles that is from 2008 to 10, public housing has always accounted for some 56%, and given your extra effort, you're only able to increase that by some 4%, so it's a very small percentage. We believe that the administration will have to look at a basket of measures in order to resolve the housing problem. We believe that we need to have some transitional housing so that for people affected by clearance, they will be given interim housing so that for residents can be housed in the short term and their living environment can be improved. Well, many grassroots are actually living in substandard housing. Well, many of the children will have to stay in bunk beds, and there are mice around, and the hygiene is really very appalling. And we believe that there should also be this rent subsidy. And we can also make reference to this community care funds arrangement. Well, on different occasions, the administration has said that, well, if we introduce a rent subsidy or CCF subsidy, then that could lead to substantial rise in rents. But then in your earlier reply to members' questions, it's not this bureau director. Well, you said that for rentals, rent fluctuation, it might have to do with the financial market and also external environment and so on. It might not necessarily have to do with rent control or rent subsidy. But then when the administration put that down in the consultation document, apparently you're saying that by introducing a rent subsidy, it would only lead to rent rises or rent hikes. I think you're shifting the focus. The administration will have to look into this more seriously. You will have to conduct evidence-based research, and then you will have to seriously consider introducing rent control and rent subsidy. You would also have to review the landlord and tenancy ordinance. We understand that you will take follow-up action within this council. What we are asking for is the reintroduction of rent control. It's not like what we had before. You can also discuss the details, and therefore the administration must trigger the review process. We should discuss in detail certain incentives for the landlords. We need to activate the process as soon as possible. Next, Hong Kong Institute of Surveyors, Mr. or Dr. Lawrence Poon. Thank you. The Institute of Surveyors welcomes the initiatives to increase housing supply. We also agree that public housing supply should also be set at a 6:4 ratio because the demand for public housing is very tight. But then for private housing, because of the changes in our economy, if the demand comes down, then the administration could also appropriately increase the ratio for public housing. But then the Institute of Surveyors is also concerned that we might not have enough land for meeting the demand without affecting conservation and our ecology. We hope that we can think out of the box to see how we can increase supply.
These measures include the development of new towns and reclamation. We understand that these approaches does not depend on whether there is sufficient land in the urban area. To develop land from reclamation and new towns is to relieve the increasing population density in urban area. As a result, and the problems brought along, say for example, unhealthy living environment. So we need to develop new towns and to explore different ways to develop land. In relation to SDUs, we understand that there are a lot of problems in SDUs, say for example hygiene and safety. But if we are to deal with 60 to 70,000 SDUs, of course most of them contravene the building ordinance. And if we phase out all 60 to 70,000 units, if you can use 20 people to deal with all these units, and it's too optimistic. We think that without affecting safety standards, we can put in place certain criteria and draw a line and first deal with unsafe SDUs, and those that are safe can be allowed to exist. Next is the Liberal Party Youth Committee. Mr. Young. Good afternoon. The Liberal Party support the 470,000 housing target in the coming 10 years. But we question one thing, that is whether they have the ability to achieve that. The CI sees that this year there is an acute manpower shortage, 10,000 people. This is serious, and compare that with the $70 billion of capital work. In the coming 10 years, it can reach $180 billion. You can imagine how serious the manpower shortage is. Can we complete the 470,000 housing target? Don't forget that we're talking about an existing manpower shortage problem. And in 10 years' time, that this situation will be worse. 68% of our laborers are over 48 years old, and there are only about 13% of the workers who are under 30 years old. And we have resources, we have money, but we don't have manpower. So is the 470,000 a real target? Is it just a mathematical sum? Or is it arrived at after elaborate and detailed calculation? Is it achievable? I hope all sectors will seriously think about that. We welcome the 470,000 housing target, but is it actually achievable? Perhaps they should start looking into manpower problems. Perhaps putting in more resources and put in place incentive to attract young people into the trade. You have land, you have money, you have resources, but you don't have the worker. So whether it's 470,000 or whatever, there won't be any worker to build houses, and in the end that will be a waste. So please seriously consider our views. Next, Liberal Party Housing Policy Committee, Mr. Dominic Lee. Good afternoon. Same as Mr. Look, of your party, we think that the ratio of public housing is too high when it comes to 60-40. Let's look at the UK, 20%, Germany, 16.2%, Japan, 6.1% of the housing is public housing. Currently, is about 48%, just under half, which is already too high. The administration proposes to increase that. By increasing the ratio of public housing, then there will be less private housing. By comparison, property prices will continue to rise, and it will be beyond the reach of young people and the middle class. We have a genuine need for housing, but is it the case that youngsters and the middle class don't have such need? Administration's policy tip towards grassroots. That itself is not a problem because we have to take care of those in need. But what about the middle class? Can we be ignored? Do you know that most of the government revenue comes from taxpayers of the middle class? The administration on one hand said that they would increase the percentage of public housing, but they ignore the problem of well-off tenants. Currently, there are about 5,000 PRH tenants paying double rental. The household income can be as high as 66,000. A lot of professionals can't even earn that much. Why does the administration put resources to this group, well-off tenants who abuse PRH resources? Why aren't they forced to give up the PRH unit while increasing PRH supply? They have to deal with a well-off tenant. Otherwise, by increasing the percentage of public housing, the problem still remains. He says that 470,000 in the coming 10 years. We agree with that in generally speaking, but do we have enough manpower? Representative of the labor sector say that there are problems with importing labor. It will affect local labor. But in the past 2 years, there is still a recruitment problem even when they increase the salary. So there is already a shortage in local worker. So we need import labor. Next is Lightbee Social Realty Company Limited, Mr. Yu. Well, today I'd like to talk about affordable and adequate housing, but not about PRH unit nor SDU. It's about a special type of housing called Guangfang. Well, there are owners who would like to help people by using their property. They don't know who to approach and they come to us. The owners will let their property at a reasonable price to people who are in need. And this fills the gap in the property market. And it's not the case that we act as a shelter home. Tenants stay here for longer than a few months, but they don't stay forever. They stay there for 1 to 3 months so that they will have some breathing space. Current market price is beyond the reach of normal citizens. So our way is to not pay attention to market rate, but take into account the affordability of our prospective tenants. The number of our flats has increased from 1 to 7 and is widely accepted by the media. There are a lot of positive reports. So we plan to increase it to 10. I hope that through our experience, the administration can take that into account and see it in a different way. There may be an innovative way or the way of a social enterprise to make better use of existing property and resources. Mr. Yu, can you tell us how many tenants? Well, there are 30 households. These cases are referred to us by social workers from the social welfare departments or Caritas. How many owners? There are about 6 owners providing such properties. Now, for some owners, after they have got the pleasant experience of renting one flat, they have now given us the second flat to rent out. Next, no flat slaves, Miss Fong. We are no flat slaves, and these are points. In relation to the LTHS, there should be more public housing and to relax the income and asset limit. 2, to do away with the QPS and to stop discriminating against youngsters, and to take into account the needs of youngsters in planning. And there should be rent control to protect people who are not eligible for PRH units. And there should be there should no longer be any policies that encourage people to buy their own house. And there should be a break away from the property hegemony. Earlier, we conducted a poll and interviewed 900 youngsters on their views of housing. Respondents don't really want to buy their own flats. Only 30% of the respondents set a target of 5 years to buy their own flat. And in relation to satisfaction rate of their current living environment, well, they think that size and connectivity is very important to youngsters. So it shows that it is not pegged to increasing their asset or other factors. They would like the press very often think that youngsters would like to buy their own flat so that they can get onto the property ladder. But the thing is, if you buy a flat, you have to spend a lot of your salary on the mortgage payment, which will affect your quality of life in the coming 10 years or more. You become enslaved to your flat. And you also have to make sure that you will not lose your job. And when they think about changing the jobs or taking up further studies, that they will have to take their flat into consideration. Youngsters are future pillars of our future. So they should not mix up having a home and purchasing a flat. They are separate. And in relation to the 60-40 ratio, they say on one hand that there should be flexibility. They did not talk about the housing supply for public housing. Mr. Lee Siu-Wang, I'm a resident of NT Northeast, and these are my views. It's not about this, whether there is sufficient housing supply, is whether there is an even distribution. Residents have been objecting to the development of NT Northeast because the administration failed to explain about why they will pick the NTNE. Why not use the golf course first? Why turn the North Point public housing estate into luxurious flat? And how come that grassroots are being chased out of old districts? Our voices are smothered. Now how can we be convinced? We are human beings. We should not be forced to sacrifice ourselves for the greater good. This is not in line with a just society. We should all be responsible for resolving the housing problem. But when it comes to development in the coming 10 years, it's made at the expense of non-indigenous villagers. And there is a very unfair housing policy. Developing anti-Northeast will not solve the problem. Don't put residents of anti-Northeast on the opposing side of SDU residents in the urban area. Well, you see that recently there is a picture for luxurious flats are left vacant, but they are all sold. Every night you see that there are lots of unlit flats in these luxurious flats. And that will be the future of anti-Northeast. You resort to rhetorics to distort the truth and to pull wool over the eyes of the public. Please seriously consider what you are doing. I only have 3 minutes. There is little I can say. But I'd like to use the opportunity to tell Hong Kong people that we have the responsibility to monitor the government. Wake up, Hong Kong people. Don't be keyboard hardmen. Come out to tell the administration how angry you are. Next. Mr. Gong. From Public Housing Living Quality Union. Well, what is the current public housing supply? Apart from quantity, we have to take into account quality. I live in II.II, and some of my colleagues live in Yat-Tong Estate. There are lots of PRH units. Apart from Kingswood Villa, most of them are PRH units, but that is of low quality. In the past, because of policy errors, a lot of low-income earners moved to Yat-Tong and II.II. And once they've moved in, they face problems of property hegemony and a lack of job opportunities. And the problem goes on. When we talk about LTHS, it's not just about where and how many. We should talk about how to proceed. We don't talk just about the size and spatial requirement. We also talk about the quality of the community. A resident living in an SDU in Sham Shui Po once moved to Yat-Tong. Yes, the living environment may be better, but as a whole, the quality of their lives is worse because before they could enjoy the cheaper prices and they have a job, and once they've moved they are forced to buy expensive stuff and they don't have a job anymore. So you don't simply move people from one place to another and leave them to their own devices. You know why II.II is a city of sadness? You know. It's because of poor planning. There is a little ink on the new development areas in the consultation paper. There should be more discussion. Should there be development, they need to pay more attention to how to develop the area. We must emphasize that we're not talking about the unit itself, but the community, the quality of lives in the community. So apart from the LTHS, it's not just about the housing ratio. In each development area, there should be a development ratio. There are a lot of grassroots people living in II.II. So your neighbors and everyone you know are just as poor as you are. There is no support network. There is little job opportunities. So the administration should put in place community planning and to avoid the problem of poverty in remote areas. All deputations have spoken, and I'd like to ask first the Secretary to respond to the views expressed by deputations and individuals, and then I will open the floor for members to ask questions. And as to how much time, and let's see after the Secretary has spoken. We've listened to deputations and individuals. I can't possibly respond to each and every view expressed, so I will give a general response. First, about the housing target.
Some people say 470,000 is too many, some say too little. When we estimated the demand, we do not consider how much can be supplied by the government specifically. Now, in the committee, we try neither to over nor underestimate. Now, 470,000 is based on new households, resettlement needs, those living in poor environments. Some figures are based on past trends. Now, some deputations say that the future may be changed. Now, it's because of these variables that the document clearly proposes that the 470,000 should be reviewed every year and updated accordingly to ensure that the estimate can tie in with the needs of society and the changes in the market. We say that it should be supply-led. That means we don't think we should just tackle any one particular problem. Now, some deputations say that there should be a standing strategy, but in the committee we feel that there is insufficient supply in the supply-demand balance, so we need to increase supply. The difficulties first, then supply. Secondly, the capacity of the construction industry. And thirdly, as one deputation mentioned, in the future there will be so much new housing, then do we have enough manpower for property management? That's very important too, how to sustain the quality of our housing. Now, quantity and quality are both important, say the deputations, and also the quality of the community. Now, in the document, there's a paragraph that saying that we should learn from the lessons of II.II, so that in the new communities there would be better planning on the 60-40 public-private ratio. Now, of course, there are different views. Some say there is not enough public housing. Others feel that there should be less on the public side. Now, in the committee, we feel that public housing should play a bigger role. Now, of course, on the ratio itself, we are prepared to listen to more views in the 3-month engagement period. Now, many speakers focused on rents and rent control and subdivided units. Now, these two issues are areas where the LTHS document seeks the public's views. Now, there are various concerns, and we say that this should be discussed in society. In electrical debates, I also mentioned that in the past period, rent increases have been rapid, and small units, we noted, have suffered higher increases. Now, a lady just now mentioned certain areas where rents for SDUs have risen a lot. So rent levels are a problem, but should we just rush into rent control? Now, just now it's been said that the Community Care Fund can provide some rental subsidy, yet the landlords use this as an excuse to raise the rents. So the money into the hands of the landlords. Now many are concerned about rent control. Speakers mentioned the experience of other countries in rent control. At THB, we also try to understand the experience in other jurisdictions on rent control. Now, on regulation of SDUs, it's not that there's no regulation of SDU right now. In industrial buildings, SDUs are illegal because people shouldn't be living in industrial buildings. Now, for residential and composite buildings, they can be subdivided for rental. Of course, the subdivision has to be in keeping with building safety and the fire safety regulations. Otherwise, the relevant departments will take enforcement action. Now, we will try to step up that action. Now, the document says that there are other possibilities like licensing. That's only a proposal. It doesn't mean that we have reached a conclusion. We are glad to listen to the public's views. And some groups, including SDU groups, are concerned that regulation may cause a decrease in supply. That's a real possibility that has to be considered. So in the resolution of problems, it's not all that simple. There might be side effects. So overall, we feel that supply is indeed inadequate. So I feel that to resolve the problem, we should take the supply line and also improve planning, etc. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Now, in the remaining time, members may ask questions. Now, the first session will take us to 4:40. There are 5 members waiting to speak. There may be more. So 3 minutes, including answers. And then remaining time will be for second round. Fernando Cheung, Leung Kwok Hong, Mark May Kyun, Albert Chan, Emily Lau. Now, since Dr. Fernando Cheung is not here, Mr. Leung Kwok Hong first. 3 minutes. Now, if I run for CE in the next term, I will say that I will reintroduce rent control. Now, before Mr. C.Y. Leung took office, he talked about this and that. Now he's in office, he said it couldn't be done. Now, actually, you can reintroduce rent control. Mr. Secretary, you look at all his vacuous promises. The only one that's practical is resumption of rent control. Now, you say there's no land. Now, the development bureau figures are all messed up. And then you say one can develop the country parks. Of course, that's not very popular. Now, have you considered the resumption of rent control? Now, the landlords will pass on their financial burdens onto tenants. The investment costs will be passed to the tenants. People cannot afford the high rents. Now, when will you engage in it? Are you going to introduce rent control? I repeat, C.Y. Leung only requires 1 square foot to announce reintroduction of rent control, and the problem will be solved 50%. Everything is difficult. You need some magic measure. Now, are you going to get that? Please leave some time for the Secretary to reply. I will cut gas to become your magic wand. I'd like to ask Mr. Cheung whether this is an opportunity. 28 seconds, Mr. Secretary. Now, on rent control, I already said that we consider this in LTHS committee, but this is something that we are looking for the public to express their views. Rent control, even if reintroduced, may not be the same as it was before. People have different views. You should not drag your feet. You should announce it and consult tomorrow. Ms. Mack? First, I'd like to thank all the deputations for coming to speak out. The FTU is like you all concerned about the housing problem. Now, apart from talking about long-term construction of PRH, now some people think that it should not focus on supply. Now, in the near term, whether those are living in SDUs and whether those are on the waiting list for PRH, now regarding them, we suggested measures. I'm asking you whether you plan to review the rent control. And some people suggested rent subsidy. Now, the FTU is very clear. For those on the waiting list, should we give them a rent subsidy in the interim? For those who are renting in the private sector, will they be afforded tax concessions? Now, these can be done quickly. Do you have the confidence to do something along these lines in the coming budget or policy address? Will you tell the CY that these should be mentioned as new policies? Now, you can divide the three areas for allocation of PRH and make it just one area, then will you adopt these things measures quickly? Now, on rent control, I will not add to my points. Now, whether in electrical or in society, when people add their views, the government will listen carefully, and I believe the CE will have heard your views. Now, on demand-led approach, now we are determining our targets based on expected demand, so we do not differ in that regard. Now, we do not say that it's demand-led because we do not like to confuse it with our demand control measures right now. So we are saying that we should keep up a high level of supply to meet people's needs. Now, on PRH allocation areas, the HA will consider the feasibility. Mr. Albert Chen. Now, right now the problems arise out of the measures, the 9 measures back then by Mr. Michael Sin. Now, many of the members supported those measures. They should blame themselves right now. Now, the government hopes to do better planning to meet housing needs, but don't expect there would be conspicuous relief in the coming 5 to 8 years. In the next 8 years, those on the waiting list will continue to be forced to pay high rents. Some who do not qualify, PRH, those marginal group, in the marginal group who are forced to live in SDUs, they are suffering. Now, building new housing is one approach. Now, in some advanced countries, they have rental subsidy for low-income families. As long as the rent is higher than 25% of the income, the excess will be paid for by the government. Now, for those who are on the waiting list for over 3 years, now this is partly done by the Community Care Fund right now. But in the next 5 to 8 years, the housing supply will not be adequate yet. Now, will you provide specific financial assistance, bearing in mind the harm done by Michael Soon's 9 measures? You should do a good deed so that those who pay high rents can have some respite. Secretary, Mr. Chen is right. If we are to turn around the serious undersupply, there is no quick fix. If we try to find a site, it will take several years. However, in the next few years, the housing supply will increase step by step. Because of the imbalance, some rents have increased sharply, especially for small units. But is rental subsidy the answer? In the LTHS document, members' views have been analyzed. There is the concern that given serious supply-demand imbalance, if we offer rent subsidy, then the subsidy may be passed on to the landlords. Now, during the coming 3-month consultation period, we hope to listen to more people's views. Ms. Emily Lau. Thank you, Chairman. Now, I thank all the deputations for coming to add their views in LegCo for our reference. Now, the Democratic Party certainly understands that the housing problem has plagued the public for a long time, and there is no quick solution. The month before last, I went to UN for the Convention of on Children's Rights, and members asked, with so many Hong Kong children living in poor environments, what can be done? The government says it's difficult to find land, etc. Now, is it that even if you find the land, the district council will not allow you to build the housing? Now, also, it's a manpower issue. Now, in the Finance Committee, I also asked the Permanent Secretary. Now, some projects have been delayed because there's insufficient manpower. The Permanent Secretary said that they just try to grab whatever manpower they can. Now, do you have any confidence that you can find the manpower to build your housing? Now, some Kai Fongs mentioned the military land. Now, are they untouchable? They are just lying idle. Now, can some of it be released? The Secretary, concerning military land, because that has been covered in questions in LegCo and also in other debates. Now, the Secretary for Security has already answered that there is a need for them, so I will not supplement. On future housing needs, we need a large increase in supply, including public housing. There is a consensus in the society for this. The figures have to be considered carefully because we need land. Otherwise, we have to get land from the cities or the development areas in various ways. Now, people are worried about high density. Will the high density be accepted? The community facilities, the transport, and other amenities. Now, we have to spend a lot of effort to talk to the local communities to tell them that they will not be overloaded. Manpower, it's not just the construction industry, it's also a problem for government departments like the housing department. Mr. Leung Yu-chung, whether it's public or private sector, the supply is inadequate for meeting demand. The government recognizes this. How to increase supply, it takes time. The problem cannot be resolved right away. So rental accommodation is always a problem. Now, it's not just for the middle class, but also for the grassroots. However, rents have kept rising sharply. There is no mechanism to suppress that. The Secretary measured the supply-demand imbalance. If there's going to be rent control, it might have a major impact that may not be appropriate. The LTHS committee also listed the factors. Now, Mr. Secretary, can you tell me when is the appropriate time for rent control? The Secretary. The LTHS committee document listed the members' concerns.
But when it comes to specific measures, we must take into account the response from the market. As we have set out in the consultation document, there is no mention that we should regulate subdivided flats. We just said that we might need to explore the possibility of introducing a regulatory system for SDUs, but then listening to the response from the landlords and those involved, they might have different sentiments or responses. We never said that we should not look into the issue of rent control. We didn't rule out that, but then we also have to look at it from a comprehensive angle. Well, you just talk about the factors that would render it not suitable. But what are the suitable factors? Because if you look at the situation of the rental market, it's crazy and it's beyond the affordability of most people, if not all. So you still said that we had to be careful about it. But so what are the factors? And if you just use this as a shield, it's not going to solve the problem. So what are your concerns? Under what circumstances would you be prepared to introduce rent control? Secretary. Well, as the paper has said, as some of the SDU groups have also shared with us some of the current situation when the supply is inadequate, when the landlord said that I'm not going to rent it to you, then the tenant basically will be at his mercy. So this is the situation on the ground. That's why at the steering committee, when we talk about rent control, our biggest concern is when supply is seriously inadequate, then will rent control actually result in even less supply? But as I said, this is just a subject and would be prepared to listen to different comments, and the steering committee is not the only source of wisdom. We'll be prepared to listen to all views. So he has not closed the door. He said that he would be prepared to consider it at the steering committee. Dr. Kwakaki. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, deputations, for coming. I hope that the Secretary would be able to tell us the effective ways to help them. You talk about the inadequate land supply and so on. Well, they are aware of that. You've also refused rent control. You've also refused to provide interim housing. So can you tell the deputations here, what solutions do you have in resolving these problems? So I don't want to hear the long-term solution. For those who have immediate needs, they are paying $60,000 to $80,000 per square feet. So how are you going to solve their problems? Dr. Kwok, I think Professor Chiang has already answered the question raised by Mr. Leung Yu Chong on rent control. You might not have arrived. He has not closed the door. He has not said no to it. So, Secretary, Chairman, well, whether it's the steering committee or me personally, increasing public housing supply, speeding up supply is the most effective way of resolving this problem. Dr. Kwok just said, well, SDU now costs $60 per square feet, whether or not it's rent subsidy or any form of rent control, and if the end result is that with this in place, the rent might be higher than $60 per square feet. This is something that the steering committee is most worried about. Another approach is, as some deputations have suggested, all right, you have some idle sites or some sites which have yet to be rezoned with government buildings on them. So can you convert them into interim housing? Some of them are located in the urban area. For example, in Kennedy Town, we all know that the old abattoirs, well, it has not been put to any use yet. So can that be turned into interim housing for them? Secretary, Chairman, often a time we heard views from the community saying that there are idle sites, and the administration is going all out to identify sites for housing construction. Even for some sites, they might have been left idle in the past, but then very rarely would they remain idle these days. And many of these sites have already been given designated use or zoning. But then during my contact with some of the groups, I've told them that if they are aware of any sites that have been left idle, please do let us know. Well, some sites might have been left idle for a while because there is already zoning. If it's just a time frame of 1 or 2 years, and if you try to provide interim housing on those sites, it's not practicable. We also have to ensure that the relevant site will have to have community facilities and transport network. Some groups suggested that, well, for sites of waiting for redevelopment, whether it's public housing and so on. Well, for public housing, according to the HA's experience, well, many of the existing tenants before, well, they would only be prepared to move out 6 months before the clearance and redevelopment, so that's not going to help. But then we have not closed the gate yet. If there are sites available for short-term use, well, from the steering committee's angle, wherever possible, with support facilities available, we'll be prepared to go for it. But then we don't think there are many such sites available. Mr. Wu Chi-wai, the last one to speak before the break, it's not your turn. So, Wu Chi-wai. Thank you, Chairman. Well, the LTHS document says that in the next 10 years, you will have to increase 282,000 PRH units. And then by 2018, well, for the units that will be available is only about 90,000, according to the paper. In other words, in the next 5 years, actually, there is a big gap to be filled. And Mr. Prescott also said several times that in the next 5 years, in terms of the sites, you have already identified them. You have already found a way to meet the target. So my question for the Bureau Director, are you able to provide the relevant information? That's very important to us. According to the steering committee, you said that, of course, it all boils down to flat production. And if you're not able to reassure the public that you're able to meet the target, that you're able to really, in the 5 years following 2018, you'll be able to build some 40,000 units every year. So if you're not able to reassure them, then the public will be extremely concerned. So given the anxiety, the entire community is asking for alternatives to resolve this housing problem. The pressure will be increasing, the temperature will be rising. So taking advantage of this platform, can you tell us, well, for the 5 years after 2018, have you already secured the sites? If that is the case, then can you tell us how you're going to make sure that it can be done? Secretary. Chairman, let me briefly give you an overview. Well, during the first 5-year period after 2018, well, we've already started the zoning. Some of the flats are already under production or works are already underway. So there are about 79,000 units for public rental housing. And then for the 5-year period starting from 2018, we're talking about 100,000. And roughly speaking, we have already identified the sites. And some of these sites will have to be zoned. Some might have to be rezoned. And we will have to go through the statutory procedures and whether or not the process would be as smooth as we had expected. But then in any case, we have already identified the sites for the production. And then for the 470,000 units, that is the total target. And when compared to what we have already pledged in terms of public or private housing, the gap is about 70,000. So that's the newly added flats or demand when compared to what we have pledged in the past. And so we will have to see if we are to adopt 470,000 as a target, then how are we going to meet that? But then can you provide further information? Well, the sites are already available, so there is already a list. So can you give us the arrangement about after 2018? Secretary, Chairman, we do have a rolling stock. So that's the figures for the next 5 years. But then, well, we might have identified the site for zoning, but then we also have to go through certain statutory procedures, and therefore it's not appropriate for us to give you the list right away. Sorry, time's up. All right, for the first session, we will end here. Thank you, deputations, for coming. But then I'd also like to remind Mr. U.I. Yip, all right, your remarks are rather interesting. So can you provide us with something in writing for members' reference, please? All right, thank you.